A lonely widow visited her husband's grave, not knowing she'd meet her soulmate there that day. The thought had never crossed Elizabeth Bennet's mind as she trudged through the rain-soaked cemetery, her black umbrella tilted against the autumn wind. 3 years had passed since Michael's heart had stopped beating, yet the pain in her chest felt as fresh as the flowers she carried. The cemetery groundskeeper had begun to recognize her. Every Sunday, rain or shine, the slender woman with chestnut hair threaded with silver would appear at exactly 10 o'clock. She would bring fresh flowers, sometimes talking in hushed tones to the granite headstone, as if Michael could hear her from wherever he might be. Today, the sky matched Elizabeth's mood, gray and weeping. 58 years old and alone in a house built for a family that never came. She and Michael had tried for years, but children weren't in God's plan for them, as her mother-in-law used to say. Now, with Michael gone, the emptiness of their 4-bedroom colonial felt like a cruel joke. "Good morning, my love," Elizabeth whispered, kneeling despite the dampness of the ground. She set down her tote bag and began removing the wilted flowers from the small copper vase embedded in the headstone. "I brought your favorites today. Yellow roses." Her fingers trembled slightly as she arranged the fresh blooms. Not from the cold, though the November chill had settled deep in her bones, but from the familiar ache that never truly subsided. "The house is too quiet," she continued, her voice barely audible above the patter of rain on her umbrella. "I've been thinking about getting a cat. Would you have minded that? You always said you were allergic, but I think you just preferred dogs." The one-sided conversation provided a strange comfort, a ritual that anchored her weeks. Between these Sunday visits and her part-time job at the local library, Elizabeth had constructed a life that, while not happy, was at least bearable. She existed rather than lived, moving through days with the emotional equivalent of autopilot. "Mrs. Peters next door keeps trying to set me up with her brother-in-law," Elizabeth said with a hint of a smile. "Can you imagine? I told her I'm perfectly fine on my own." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Fine was a stretch. Surviving was more accurate. As she spoke, her gaze drifted across the cemetery. Sunday mornings were usually quiet, with only the occasional visitor. Today, however, someone else was there. A man, perhaps in his early 60s, kneeling at a grave about 30 yards away. No umbrella, just a dark blue raincoat with the hood pulled up. Something about his solitary figure, shoulders hunched against both weather and grief, struck a chord of recognition in Elizabeth. She looked away quickly, feeling as though she'd intruded on a private moment. Everyone deserved the dignity of mourning without an audience. Elizabeth continued her one-sided update with Michael, telling him about the new exhibit at the library, the leak in the upstairs bathroom she'd finally gotten fixed, and the letter she'd received from his sister in Arizona. Small details of a small life, but she knew Michael would have wanted to hear them. When she finally stood, her knees protesting the movement, she noticed the man was still there, still kneeling. The rain had intensified, no longer a gentle drizzle but a steady downpour. Even with her umbrella, Elizabeth's shoes were soaked through. This stranger, without any protection from the elements, must be drenched. She hesitated, clutching her tote bag closer. The old Elizabeth, the one who existed before grief had hollowed her out, would have approached without a second thought, offered shelter beneath her umbrella, maybe a kind word. The new Elizabeth, the widow, had grown unaccustomed to initiating contact with strangers, but something about the man's stillness, the utter desolation in his posture, pulled at her. Before she could second-guess herself, Elizabeth found herself walking toward him, her footsteps whispering against the wet grass. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice rusty from disuse. "I thought you might like to share my umbrella." The man didn't respond immediately. For a moment, Elizabeth feared he hadn't heard her over the rain, or worse, that he wished to be left alone. She was about to retreat when he slowly turned his face upward. His eyes were the color of faded denim, rimmed with red and filled with a pain so familiar it stole Elizabeth's breath. Rain streaked down his face, indistinguishable from tears. Silver hair, soaked flat against his head, framed features that might once have been handsome before grief had carved its harsh lines. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from far away. "But I'm fine." Elizabeth knew a lie when she heard one. She'd told the same one countless times herself. "You're soaked through," she observed, stepping closer so that her umbrella sheltered them both. "And it's only getting worse." The man blinked, as if just noticing the intensity of the rain. He looked down at himself, at the water dripping from his sleeves, and something like surprise flickered across his face. "I guess I lost track of time," he admitted. Elizabeth nodded toward the headstone he'd been kneeling before. A woman's name was etched in the granite, Catherine Ann Wilson. Below it, dates marking 63 years of life ended just 2 months ago. "Your wife?" Elizabeth asked gently. 41 years, he confirmed, his voice catching. "It still doesn't seem real." The raw edge in his words resonated with Elizabeth's own pain, that disbelief that never fully dissipated, the constant expectation that at any moment the person you'd lost would walk through the door, laugh at the absurdity of your grief, and life would continue as it should have. "I understand," she said simply, because she did. "I'm Elizabeth Bennet." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Like the character?" Elizabeth felt an unexpected warmth in her cheeks. "My mother was a great fan of Jane Austen." "And you are?" "Daniel Wilson. Danny to friends." He glanced back at Catherine's grave. "To Kate." The rain drummed steadily on Elizabeth's umbrella as they stood in silence, two strangers connected by parallel losses. Elizabeth found herself studying Daniel's profile, the strong jawline softened by age, the deep creases at the corners of his eyes, suggesting a man who had once smiled often. "There's a coffee shop just outside the cemetery," Elizabeth heard herself saying. "Warm drinks might do us both good. Unless you'd prefer to stay." Daniel looked surprised at the invitation, or perhaps at the fact that Elizabeth had been the one to extend it. He hesitated, and for a moment Elizabeth was certain he would decline. Then he nodded just once. "Coffee sounds good," he said. "I think Kate would approve. She always hated seeing me catch colds." As they walked toward the cemetery gates, Elizabeth maintained a respectful distance, their shoulders not quite touching beneath the shared umbrella. Neither spoke much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. There was something almost soothing about walking alongside someone who understood the weight she carried without explanation. The coffee shop, Beans and Brew, was a small, cozy establishment with steamed windows and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee beans. Sunday morning meant it was relatively quiet. Just a few patrons scattered among the worn leather armchairs and wooden tables. "I come here sometimes after," Elizabeth explained as they shook rain from their coats by the door. "They make a decent cup." Daniel nodded, his eyes taking in the space with the slightly dazed look of someone who hadn't been in such a normal, everyday place in some time. Elizabeth recognized that look too, the surreal feeling that the world continued to serve coffee and play soft jazz while your personal universe had collapsed. They ordered a simple black coffee for Daniel, a chai latte for Elizabeth, and settled at a corner table away from the windows. Daniel's hands, large and weathered with prominent veins, wrapped around his mug as if seeking warmth. 2 months, Elizabeth said, not a question but an acknowledgement. Daniel nodded. August 17th. Pancreatic cancer. Too advanced by the time they found it. His words were clipped, clinical, a defense mechanism Elizabeth knew well. Stating the facts without the emotional context made them marginally easier to voice. "I'm sorry," she offered, knowing the inadequacy of the words even as she spoke them. "My husband Michael, it was 3 years ago. Heart attack. Completely unexpected." Daniel's eyes met hers, a flash of understanding passing between them. "Does it get easier?" he asked, the question so quiet she almost missed it. Elizabeth considered lying, offering the platitude that time heals all wounds. Instead, she gave him the truth she wished someone had given her. Not easier, different. The grief changes shape. Some days it's a stone in your pocket, noticeable but manageable. Other days it's a boulder on your chest. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Today was a boulder day. Yes, Elizabeth agreed, wrapping her fingers around her warm mug. The weather doesn't help. Kate loved the rain, Daniel said, a faraway look crossing his features. She used to drag me out for walks in it. Liquid sunshine, she called it. The corner of Elizabeth's mouth lifted. Michael hated it. Claimed it made his joints ache like an old man's, even in his 40s. A chuckle, rusty from disuse, escaped Daniel. Sounds like we should have swapped spouses on rainy days. The moment the words left his mouth, his expression clouded, as if he'd said something terrible. But Elizabeth felt a small bubble of laughter rise in her throat, unexpected, almost forgotten, and she let it out. "They would have gotten along splendidly, I think," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Michael was in construction, always building or fixing something. Kate was an elementary school teacher, Daniel offered. 1st grade. had a way of explaining complex things so simply that even I could understand them, and just like that they began to share. Small fragments at first: Kate's collection of ceramic frogs, Michael's obsession with World War II documentaries, the vacation to Maine where it rained for 7 days straight, the time Daniel tried to surprise Kate with breakfast in bed and set off all the smoke alarms. For Elizabeth, speaking Michael's name aloud to someone who had never known him felt strange at first, then increasingly liberating. Each memory shared seemed to lift a small weight from her shoulders rather than add to her burden. The rain continued outside, but neither of them noticed when it began to ease, then stop altogether. Their coffee cups emptied and were refilled. The lunch crowd began to filter in, yet they remained, each story opening the door for another. "I should let you get on with your day," Daniel said finally, appearing startled when he checked his watch and saw that nearly 3 hours had passed. Elizabeth felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "Yes, I suppose we've monopolized this table long enough." They gathered their things slowly, neither seeming eager to end the conversation. At the door, Daniel paused, his hand hesitating on the handle. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice uncertain, "would it be inappropriate? That is, would you consider—" He took a breath, collecting himself. "I've enjoyed talking with you. Perhaps we could do it again sometime?" The question hung between them, charged with complexity. Elizabeth felt a flutter of something in her chest. Not quite anxiety, not quite excitement, but a blend of both that she hadn't experienced in years. "I'd like that," she said simply. They exchanged phone numbers, Daniel recording hers in a battered flip phone that made Elizabeth smile, and parted ways outside the coffee shop. The sky had cleared to a pale blue, the earlier storm leaving everything looking washed clean. "Same time next Sunday?" Daniel asked, squinting slightly in the unexpected sunlight. Elizabeth nodded. "I'll be there." As she walked to her car, Elizabeth felt oddly lighter, as if the conversation had allowed her to set down something heavy she'd been carrying. It wasn't until she was halfway home that she realized she hadn't said goodbye to Michael before leaving the cemetery, breaking her 3-year ritual for the first time. The realization brought a complex tangle of emotions. Guilt, certainly, but also something else. A tiny crack in the shell of grief that had encased her for so long, allowing a sliver of light to penetrate. She turned on the radio, something she rarely did when driving alone. The familiar opening notes of an old Beatles song, "Here Comes the Sun," filled the car. Elizabeth didn't change the station. That evening, as dusk settled over her too large, too quiet house, Elizabeth found herself doing something she hadn't done in months. She called her sister. "Lizzie?" Jean's voice came through, surprised but pleased. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Elizabeth said, realizing she meant it more than usual. "I just wanted to hear your voice. Tell me about the grandkids." As Jean launched into stories about her twin grandson's latest antics, Elizabeth curled up on the window seat that overlooked her neglected garden. The space where Michael had planned to build a greenhouse someday stood empty, collecting fallen leaves and broken promises. For the first time, Elizabeth allowed herself to wonder what it might look like with flowers instead. The week passed with unusual quickness. Elizabeth found herself thinking of Daniel at odd moments, while shelving books at the library, cooking dinner for one, or lying awake in the pre-dawn hours when the house's emptiness felt most acute. She wondered if he was sleeping any better than she had in those first raw months. If he too woke reaching for someone who wasn't there. When Sunday arrived with clear skies and unseasonable warmth, Elizabeth spent extra time choosing her outfit. Nothing fancy, just a soft blue sweater instead of her usual black or gray. She brushed her hair with more care than usual, even adding a touch of the lipstick that had gathered dust on her vanity. These small actions felt significant, like tender green shoots pushing through long frozen ground. Not recovery, not yet, but perhaps the first tentative steps toward it. At the cemetery, Elizabeth made her way to Michael's grave with a bouquet of mixed flowers rather than his favorite yellow roses. She knelt, touching the cool granite with familiar fingers. "I met someone," she told him, her voice steady in the morning quiet. "Not like that. Just someone who understands. His name is Daniel, and he lost his wife recently." She traced the engraved letters of Michael's name. "I think you would have liked him. He builds things too, furniture, he mentioned." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves around the headstone, and Elizabeth allowed herself to imagine it was Michael's way of responding. Not with jealousy or possessiveness, he had never been that kind of man, but with the generous warmth that had drawn her to him from the beginning. I miss you, she continued, because it was true and always would be. That hasn't changed. I don't think it ever will. When she stood, she spotted Daniel making his way along the path toward Catherine's grave. He wore a brown leather jacket and carried a small potted plant rather than cut flowers. He hadn't noticed her yet, his attention focused on the path ahead, his expression solemn but somehow lighter than the previous week. Elizabeth waited until he had placed the plant, something with delicate purple blooms, before approaching. She gave him space to have his private moment, just as he had waited for her to finish before joining her at Michael's grave. They're African violets, Daniel explained when she drew near. Kate could grow them like nobody's business. I've killed 3 already trying to keep this one alive. The admission held a note of self-deprecating humor that made Elizabeth smile. I have a similar effect on houseplants. Michael used to say I had the opposite of a green thumb. They stood together in companionable silence, looking down at Catherine's resting place. Then Daniel turned to her, those faded blue eyes warmer than she remembered. Coffee again? He asked. Elizabeth nodded. I'd like that. This time, their walk felt less like strangers sharing an umbrella and more like... Friends wasn't quite the right word. Not yet, but perhaps fellow travelers on a difficult road. Daniel asked about her week, and Elizabeth found herself sharing details she normally would have considered too mundane. A mix-up with the library's new computerized catalog system, the cardinal that had taken to visiting her bird feeder, the recipe she'd tried that had turned out surprisingly well. At Beans and Brew, they claimed the same corner table without discussion. The barista, a young woman with an intricate sleeve of tattoos, greeted Elizabeth by name. The usual, Mrs. B? And for your friend? Black coffee, please, Tessa, Daniel answered before Elizabeth could respond. At her raised eyebrow, he added, I noticed the name tag last time. There was something endearing about his attentiveness, Elizabeth thought as they settled with their drinks. Not that she was looking to be endeared, of course. This was just companionship. 2 people sharing the uncommon experience of midlife widowhood. Yet as Daniel told her about his week, the leak in his garage roof, his daughter's concerned phone calls from Seattle, the support group meeting he'd forced himself to attend, Elizabeth found herself noticing things. The way one eyebrow raised slightly higher than the other when he was being wry, the careful precision with which his large hands held the delicate coffee cup, the bass notes in his voice that seemed to resonate in her chest when he laughed. I'm boring you, Daniel said suddenly, interrupting his own story about a furniture restoration project. Not at all, Elizabeth protested. I was just admiring you didn't seem appropriate. Listening. Daniel studied her face, and Elizabeth had the disconcerting feeling he could see more than she intended to reveal. You have very expressive eyes, Elizabeth Bennet. Anyone ever tell you that? Heat crept up her neck. My husband used to say he could always tell when I was lying because my left eye twitched. Does it? Daniel leaned forward slightly, interested. Only when I'm extremely uncomfortable with the fib, Elizabeth admitted. Like when his mother would ask if I enjoyed her meatloaf. Daniel's laugh, a rich, warm sound, drew glances from nearby tables. Kate would elbow me under the table whenever I was about to put my foot in my mouth at family gatherings. By the end, my ribs were perpetually bruised. The easy way he spoke of Catherine, with love but without his voice breaking, gave Elizabeth hope. 2 months in, Daniel could recall happy memories alongside the pain. Perhaps grief did evolve, as she'd told him, changing from something that consumed you entirely to something you carried alongside everything else. Do you have children? Elizabeth asked, realizing they hadn't touched on that subject the previous week. One daughter, Megan, lives in Seattle with her wife, Joni. They're trying to convince me to move out there. His smile turned wistful. What about you? No, Elizabeth said, the familiar pang accompanying the word. We tried for years, but it never happened. Daniel's expression held simple understanding, not the pity or awkward sympathy Elizabeth had grown accustomed to. That must have been difficult. It was for a while, she acknowledged. Eventually, we made peace with it. Became the favorite aunt and uncle to our nieces and nephews instead. She stirred her chai absently. Michael would have been a wonderful father. I'm sure you would have been a wonderful mother, Daniel replied quietly. Elizabeth looked up, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, not just kindness, but a genuine belief in what he'd said, that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. Thank you, she managed, blinking back sudden moisture. Their conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics, books they'd enjoyed, places they'd traveled, the merits of various cooking shows. Elizabeth discovered that Daniel had been an architect before retirement, which explained his appreciation for structure and detail. She told him about her 25 years teaching high school English before switching to part-time library work after Michael's death. Pride and Prejudice? Daniel asked with a teasing smile. Required reading in your classroom, I assume? Naturally, Elizabeth laughed. Though I favored persuasion, actually. Second chances and all that. Something flickered in Daniel's expression, a momentary intensity that made Elizabeth's heart skip. But he simply nodded and asked about her other favorite books. When they parted that afternoon, the goodbye felt different from the previous week, less tentative, more certain of continuation. Next Sunday? Daniel confirmed, standing a bit closer than strictly necessary in the coffee shop doorway. Next Sunday, Elizabeth agreed. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, or sooner, if you'd like. The library is having a talk on Thursday evening. Local history, nothing exciting, but I'd love to, Daniel said before she could finish. What time? They arranged to meet at the library at 6, and Elizabeth drove home with a strange, unfamiliar sensation expanding in her chest. It took her several miles to identify it. Anticipation. She was looking forward to something. That night she dreamed of Michael for the first time in months. Not the recurring nightmare where she found him collapsed on the kitchen floor, but a gentle dream where he sat across from her at their dining table, smiling. I like him, Dream Michael said simply. He notices things. Elizabeth woke with tears on her face, but they weren't entirely tears of sadness. Thursday arrived with unexpected nervousness. Elizabeth changed her outfit twice before settling on a burgundy dress she'd bought years ago and rarely worn. At the library, she kept glancing at the clock as 6 o'clock approached, wondering if Daniel would actually come, if she'd misinterpreted their connection. At 5:55, he walked through the door, looking slightly out of place among the regular library patrons. He'd worn a tie, Elizabeth noticed with a warm flutter in her chest. Navy blue with small silver diamonds, slightly crooked. You came, she said, immediately feeling foolish for the obvious statement. I said I would, Daniel replied, as if keeping one's word was the most natural thing in the world. His eyes took in her dress with appreciative subtlety. You look lovely, Elizabeth. The historian's talk was, as Elizabeth had warned, not particularly exciting, a dry recounting of the town's founding and industrial development. But sitting beside Daniel in the back row of folding chairs, occasionally exchanging glances when the speaker made a particularly labored joke, Elizabeth couldn't remember enjoying a lecture more. Afterward, Daniel suggested they grab dinner at the diner across the street. Unless you have other plans? He added quickly. No other plans, Elizabeth assured him, wondering when she'd last had plans worth mentioning on a weeknight. The diner was a local institution, unchanged since the 1970s with its red vinyl booths and slightly sticky menus. They ordered burgers and shared a plate of fries, talking as if they'd known each other for years rather than weeks. Megan thinks I should start dating, Daniel said suddenly, salt shaker poised above his fries. She sent me a link to one of those online services. For seniors. His nose wrinkled slightly at the word. Elizabeth nearly choked on her water. My sister's been saying the same thing. Apparently her dentist's brother is every distinguished and still has most of his hair. They laughed together, but something had shifted in the air between them. A new awareness, a question unasked. It feels impossible, Daniel said quietly. The idea of starting again, with someone new. Yes, Elizabeth agreed, her eyes meeting his. Impossible. Yet the word hung between them, losing conviction with each passing moment. When Daniel walked her to her car after dinner, he hesitated, then reached for her hand. His palm was warm and slightly rough against hers, the contact sending an almost electric current up Elizabeth's arm. Thank you for inviting me tonight, he said, his voice lower than usual. Thank you for coming, Elizabeth replied, suddenly breathless. They stood like that, hands loosely clasped, for several heartbeats. Then Daniel slowly released her, stepping back with a soft smile. Sunday? He asked. Sunday, Elizabeth confirmed. She drove home with the phantom sensation of his hand still warming hers, wondering what Michael would have thought of this development. Not dating. It wasn't dating, she told herself firmly. Just connection. Human contact. Something she'd been starved for without realizing it. The Sunday ritual evolved over the following weeks. They still visited their respective spouses' graves, but they began to arrive at the cemetery together, Daniel picking Elizabeth up in his sensible gray sedan. They would give each other private time at the graves, then reunite for coffee that inevitably stretched into lunch. Elizabeth learned that Daniel snored, according to his late wife, that he had a peculiar aversion to the texture of mushrooms, but would eat almost anything else, that he'd been briefly famous in architectural circles for designing an award-winning library in Portland, that he cried at Pixar movies but tried to hide it. Daniel discovered Elizabeth's passion for crossword puzzles, her secret addiction to reality baking shows, her collection of first-edition classics inherited from her grandfather, her ability to identify birds by their calls alone. Neither spoke directly about what was happening between them, this gradual intertwining of lives previously separate. But by the time December arrived with its holiday decorations and forced cheer, they were seeing each other 3 or 4 times a week, for walks in the park, for movies at the old theater downtown, for quiet dinners at out-of-the-way restaurants where they wouldn't bump into too many curious acquaintances. "Will you spend Christmas with Megan?" Elizabeth asked one evening as they strolled through the town's holiday market, watching children line up to visit Santa. Daniel's hand found hers, a gesture that had become commonplace between them. "She invited me, but..." he hesitated. "The thought of celebrating without Kate still feels wrong." "This will be the first Christmas." Elizabeth squeezed his fingers gently. "The firsts are the hardest. I spent my first Christmas after Michael died in bed with the curtains closed. Wouldn't answer the door or the phone." "What about this year?" Daniel asked, his eyes reflecting the colored lights strung above the market stalls. Elizabeth considered the question. Previous Christmases since Michael's death had been quiet affairs, dinner with her sister's family, presents exchanged with minimal fuss, an early departure with the excuse of tiredness. She'd gone through the motions without feeling the spirit of the season. "I hadn't really thought about it," she admitted. "Jean will invite me, of course, but..." Daniel stopped walking, turning to face her. Around them, the market continued its festive bustle, but his expression was serious. "Would you consider spending it with me?" he asked. "Not the whole day if you have family obligations. But perhaps Christmas Eve? I could cook dinner," a self-deprecating smile. "Nothing fancy, but better than being alone." The invitation hung between them, weighted with significance beyond a simple holiday meal. Elizabeth felt her heart beating rapidly beneath her winter coat. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. Daniel's smile transformed his face, erasing years of worry and grief in an instant. Without thinking, Elizabeth reached up to touch his cheek, her fingertips brushing against the silver stubble along his jaw. The contact seemed to surprise them both. Daniel's breath caught visibly, his eyes darkening. For a moment, Elizabeth thought he might kiss her, right there amid the Christmas trees and gingerbread stands. Instead, he turned his face slightly, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. The gesture, somehow more intimate than a proper kiss would have been, sent warmth spreading through Elizabeth's entire body. "It's a date, then," he said, his voice rough. A date. The word they'd both been carefully avoiding for weeks. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As Christmas Eve approached, Elizabeth found herself experiencing something she'd thought long past: anticipation. She bought a new dress, deep green velvet that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. She had her hair trimmed and styled. She even, after much deliberation, purchased a small gift for Daniel, a rare first edition of a novel by an architect-turned-author he'd mentioned admiring. She told Michael about it during her Sunday visit, which now included time alone at his grave before Daniel joined her. "I'm nervous," she confessed to the headstone. "Is that silly? At my age, being nervous about a dinner date?" She traced the familiar letters of his name, worn smooth by weather and time. "I'm not forgetting you. I could never forget you. But I think you'd want me to be happy." The wind whispered through the bare branches overhead, and Elizabeth allowed herself to imagine it as Michael's blessing. Daniel's house was a craftsman-style bungalow on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. Elizabeth had driven past it before but never been inside. As she approached the front door, gift tucked under her arm, she took a steadying breath. Before she could knock, the door swung open. Daniel stood there in dark slacks and a forest green sweater that nearly matched her dress, as if they'd coordinated without planning to. His face lit up at the sight of her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "So do you," Elizabeth replied, then blushed. "Handsome, I mean." Daniel laughed, the sound warming her more effectively than the heat spilling from the open doorway. "I'll take beautiful. Come in, please." The interior of Daniel's home revealed his architectural background, clean lines and thoughtful details, but softened with comfortable furnishings and personal touches. Photographs lined the hallway, many featuring a woman Elizabeth recognized from her headstone, Catherine. Slender, with a bright smile and intelligent eyes often captured mid-laugh, Elizabeth paused, studying one where Catherine and Daniel stood on what appeared to be a hiking trail, arms around each other, faces glowing with health and happiness. "That was 5 years ago," Daniel said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Glacier National Park. One of our favorite places." Elizabeth turned to him, searching his face for signs of distress at having her here, in the home he'd shared with Catherine. But his expression held only gentle remembrance, not the sharp edge of ongoing grief. "She was beautiful," Elizabeth said sincerely. "Yes," Daniel agreed. "Inside and out." He hesitated, then added, "She would have liked you, I think. You have the same no-nonsense approach to life." The comparison might have bothered some women, but Elizabeth found it oddly comforting. Daniel wasn't pretending Catherine had never existed, or that she hadn't been deeply loved. He was simply acknowledging that his heart had room for both memories and new feelings. "I wish I could have met her," Elizabeth said. "And I wish you could have known Michael." Daniel's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "In a way, I feel like I do know him through your stories." He led her into a dining room where the table was set with obvious care, good china, cloth napkins, candles waiting to be lit. The smell of something delicious wafted from the kitchen. "I hope you like lasagna," Daniel said. "It's one of the few dishes I've mastered over the years." "I love it," Elizabeth assured him, touched by the effort he'd clearly put into the evening. Dinner was delicious, the conversation easy and warm. They avoided talk of their late spouses, not out of discomfort, but because tonight seemed meant for the present rather than the past. Instead, they shared childhood Christmas memories, favorite holiday traditions, hopes for the new year approaching. After dessert, a store-bought pie Daniel apologetically admitted he'd claimed as homemade, they moved to the living room. A small Christmas tree twinkled in the corner, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. "I have something for you," Elizabeth said, suddenly shy as she handed him the carefully wrapped package. Daniel's surprise was evident. "You didn't have to get me anything." "I wanted to," she said simply. He unwrapped it with careful fingers, his expression transforming to one of wonder as he recognized what he held. "Elizabeth, how did you even find this? It's been out of print for decades." "The advantages of working in a library," she said, pleased by his reaction. "And I may have made a few calls to rare book dealers. This is incredible." He ran his fingers reverently over the embossed cover. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything. Your face says it all." Daniel set the book carefully aside. "I have something for you too, actually, though it's not nearly as impressive." He retrieved a small box from beneath the Christmas tree, wrapped in silver paper with a blue bow. Elizabeth unwrapped it to find a delicate silver bookmark, etched with a pattern of birds in flight. "I noticed you used torn scraps of paper to mark your place," Daniel explained. "I thought this might be more elegant. And the birds made me think of you, how you always pause our walks to point out different species." The thoughtfulness of the gift, that he'd noticed such a small detail about her habits, brought unexpected tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "It's perfect." "Thank you." The fire popped and hissed, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, the first of the season. The moment felt suspended, magical in a way Elizabeth had forgotten was possible. Daniel moved closer on the couch, his knee brushing against hers. "Elizabeth," he said softly, her name a question. She met his gaze, seeing in it the same mixture of hope and uncertainty she felt herself. "Yes?" His hand came up to gently cup her cheek. "May I kiss you?" The question, so formally asked, made Elizabeth smile even as her heart raced. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." Daniel leaned forward, closing the distance between them with careful deliberation. His lips were warm and soft against hers, the kiss gentle and questioning at first, then deepening as Elizabeth responded. Her hand found its way to his shoulder, steadying herself against the surprising rush of sensation. When they finally drew apart, Elizabeth felt slightly dazed, as if waking from a vivid dream. Daniel's eyes searched hers, his thumb stroking gently across her cheekbone. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Daniel's expression grew serious. "Because I needed to be sure it wasn't just loneliness." That it was you, specifically you, that I wanted to kiss. The confession struck Elizabeth to her core. She'd wondered the same thing herself, if their connection was merely the result of shared grief, a convenient antidote to solitude. "And," she prompted. "And I'm very sure," Daniel said, his voice low and certain. "I think I've been sure since that first day in the rain." Elizabeth thought of that day, how a simple act of kindness, offering an umbrella to a stranger, had somehow led to this moment. The improbability of it all struck her suddenly, bringing a bubble of laughter to her lips. "What's funny?" Daniel asked, smiling uncertainly. "Just thinking about how we met," Elizabeth explained. "A lonely widow visited her husband's grave, not knowing she'd meet her soulmate there that day." She paused, surprised by her own choice of words. "Not that I'm saying—" Daniel silenced her with another gentle kiss. "I know what you meant," he said when they parted. "And maybe it's too soon to use words like that, but I do know that meeting you has been the most unexpected gift." Elizabeth leaned her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of him, cedar and coffee and something indefinably his own. "I wasn't looking for this," she whispered. "Neither was I," Daniel agreed. "But here we are." Here they were indeed. Two people who had loved and lost, finding in each other not replacements for what they'd lost, but something new and surprising. A second chapter neither had expected to write. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white. Inside, by firelight, Elizabeth Bennet discovered that the heart's capacity for love wasn't finite after all, that loving again didn't diminish what came before, but rather honored it in the most profound way possible. As midnight approached, marking the transition to Christmas Day, Daniel pulled Elizabeth closer on the couch, wrapping a soft throw blanket around them both. "Merry Christmas, Elizabeth," he murmured against her hair. "Merry Christmas, Daniel," she replied, nestling into the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in 3 years, the words didn't feel hollow or painful. Instead, they held a promise, of hope rekindled, of joy rediscovered, of a future neither had dared to imagine until now. A lonely widow had visited her husband's grave, not knowing she'd meet her soulmate there that day. But perhaps, Elizabeth thought as she drifted to sleep in Daniel's arms, perhaps Michael and Catherine had known all along,